The year was 2347 by Earth's calendar, and humanity had spent 200 years as members of the Galactic Concord, a massive alliance of 47 different species that stretched across thousands of star systems. And in all that time, humans had learned one painful truth about their place in the universe. They were tolerated, but never respected. Ambassador Alara Chun stood in the great chamber of the Concord Council, her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, her face calm and composed as she listened to the veilless speaker drone on about trade regulations. And she had stood in this same spot for 30 years now, representing Earth and all of human space. And in all those years, she had never once raised her voice in anger. Never once shown the frustration that burned in her chest. The Veilith were ancient insectoid beings with bodies like crystallized amber and eyes that held the cold light of dying stars. And they had founded the Concord over 100,000 years ago, back when humanity's ancestors were still learning to make fire. And they looked at humans the way a gardener might look at a particularly stubborn weed that refused to die no matter how many times it was cut back. Beside the Valis speaker stood the Korath representative, a massive reptilian creature covered in dark green scales, with teeth like serrated knives and eyes full of contempt. And the Korath had been the enforcers of the Concord for millennia, their warrior fleets keeping the peace through fear and overwhelming force. And they hated humanity more than any other species in the galaxy. The Korath called humans soft meat in their own language, and they made no effort to hide their disgust at having to share the same council chamber with such weak and emotional creatures. And whenever Ambassador Chun spoke, the Korath representative would turn his head away as if the very sound of her voice was an insult to his ears. But Alara Chun had learned patience in her 30 years of service. The same patience that humanity as a whole had learned in their 2 centuries among the stars. And she smiled politely and continued her report on human trade activities, knowing that every word she spoke was being recorded, analyzed, and ultimately dismissed by beings who saw her species as nothing more than clever animals. When humanity first made contact with the Concord, they had been so full of hope and wonder, believing that the universe was full of friends waiting to be made. But they quickly learned that the galaxy was not a friendly place, and the elder species had rules about how young civilizations should behave. Humans were assigned to what the Concord called a developmental zone, a small cluster of marginal star systems on the edge of civilized space, and they were told that they could expand no further until they proved themselves worthy, though no one ever explained what worthy actually meant or how it could be achieved. The trade restrictions were the worst part, as humans were forbidden from selling their most advanced technologies to other species, while being forced to pay premium prices for basic resources that the elder races controlled. And every time human diplomats tried to negotiate better terms, they were reminded of their place in the galactic hierarchy. Some humans grew angry at this treatment, demanding that Earth withdraw from the Concord and chart its own course through the stars. But the leaders of humanity knew that isolation meant death, as the Korath fleets would descend on human worlds within months, claiming that they were protecting galactic stability while they burned cities and enslaved survivors. So humanity did what humanity had always done throughout its long and bloody history. They adapted, they endured, and they waited, building their strength in secret while wearing masks of compliance and cooperation. Admiral Marcus Cole was an old man now, his hair white as snow and his face lined with the weight of decades. But his eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had made him the youngest fleet commander in human history. And he spent his days in fleet command on Earth, watching the galaxy spin by on holographic displays, while he remembered the stories his grandmother used to tell. His grandmother had been a child during the First Contact War, when the Korath first arrived in human space and demanded immediate surrender, and when humanity refused, the reptilian warriors had demonstrated their power by destroying 3 colony worlds in a single day, killing over 200 million people in what they called a necessary lesson. The Velith had intervened then, not out of kindness but out of practicality, as they saw potential in these strange bipedal creatures who had somehow developed faster than light travel despite their primitive nature. And they offered humanity a choice: join the Concord as a junior member, or face total annihilation. Humanity chose survival. But they never forgot the lesson the Korath had taught them. And that memory was passed down from generation to generation like a sacred flame, burning quietly in the hearts of billions who smiled at their alien masters while counting the days until the balance of power would shift. Ambassador Chung finished her report and stepped back from the speaking platform, her face betraying nothing of her inner thoughts. And she noticed that the Korath representative had left the chamber entirely, not even bothering to pretend interest in human affairs. The Velith speaker made a dismissive gesture with one of its crystalline limbs and moved on to the next item on the agenda. Something about mining rights in a distant nebula. And Alara Chun took her seat among the other junior ambassadors, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her personal communicator vibrated against her wrist, a subtle pulse that told her she had received a priority message from Earth. And she excused herself quietly and made her way to a private chamber, where she could read the message without alien eyes watching over her shoulder. The message was brief and devastating. The colony ship Meridian Hope had gone silent near the border of Korath space, and the 50,000 settlers aboard were presumed lost. And preliminary reports suggested that Korath patrol vessels had been detected in the area. Shortly before all contact was severed, Alara Chun read the message 3 times, her face still calm and composed even as her heart turned to ice in her chest. And then she deleted the message and returned to the council chamber, taking her seat once more among the junior ambassadors while the Velith speaker continued its endless droning about matters that suddenly seemed very small and very far away. 200 years of patience, she thought to herself, and still they test us. Still they push us. Still they believe we will always bend rather than break. She looked at the empty seat where the Korath representative had been sitting, and for the first time in 30 years of diplomatic service, Ambassador Alara Chun allowed herself to imagine what it would feel like to watch that seat remain empty forever. The truth about the Meridian Hope came slowly at first, in fragments of intercepted transmissions and desperate final messages from crew members who knew they were about to die. And when the full picture finally emerged, it was worse than anyone had imagined. A Korath patrol fleet had intercepted the colony ship in what the reptilian warriors claimed was disputed territory. Though human navigators had checked and rechecked the route to ensure it stayed well within recognized human space, and the Korath commander had ordered the ship to surrender immediately for inspection, Captain Sarah Okonkwo of the Meridian Hope had complied with every demand, opening her cargo base for inspection and providing passenger manifests and travel documents, because she knew that resistance against a Korath patrol meant certain death for everyone aboard. And she had 50,000 souls depending on her to keep them safe. The Korath had boarded the ship, walked through the corridors where families huddled together in fear, looked into the eyes of children who had never seen an alien before. And then they had returned to their own vessels and declared that the colony ship was carrying contraband biological materials. That posed a threat to Korath security. There was no contraband, of course, just seeds and soil samples and farming equipment intended for the new colony world. But the Korath commander had already made his decision. And within minutes of the boarding party's return, the patrol fleet opened fire on the Meridian Hope's engine section, crippling the ship and leaving it drifting in the cold void between stars. And then they had vented the atmosphere 50,000 men, Women and children died watching the stars through frozen viewports. Their last moments captured on internal cameras that would later be recovered by human rescue vessels. And the recording showed everything: the panic, the prayers, the parents trying to shield their children from the cold that crept in from every direction. Ambassador Alara Chan stood before the Concorde Council 3 days later, her voice steady and clear as she presented the evidence of what could only be called a massacre. And she watched the faces of the alien delegates as they viewed the recordings, looking for any sign of sympathy or outrage or even mild concern. The Vala speaker sat motionless throughout the presentation, its crystalline eyes reflecting the images of dying humans without any visible reaction. And when Chun finished speaking and demanded justice for the murdered colonists, the ancient insectoid made a sound that might have been a sigh. The incident was regrettable but legally ambiguous, the speaker declared, because the Korath had interpreted the situation as a potential security threat. And under Concord protocols, member species had the right to defend themselves against perceived dangers, even if those perceptions later proved to be incorrect. Chun asked if the Concorde would at least conduct an investigation to determine whether the Korath commander had acted appropriately. And the speaker replied that such an investigation would require the cooperation of the Korath Dominion, which had already stated that it considered the matter closed. The seat reserved for the Korath representative remained empty throughout the entire session, a deliberate insult that every delegate in the chamber understood back on Earth. Admiral Marcus Cole watched the proceedings from Fleet Command, surrounded by officers who had served with him for decades, men and women who had spent their careers preparing for a war they hoped would never come. And the old man's hands trembled slightly as he listened to the Valus speaker dismiss the deaths of 50,000 humans as a bureaucratic inconvenience. His grandmother would have known what to do, he thought, because she had survived the first contact war and had raised her children and grandchildren with stories of human resilience and human determination. And she had always said that patience was a weapon that could cut deeper than any blade, if you knew how to use it. The Concorde offered reparations for the unfortunate incident, mining rights to a barren moon on the edge of human space, a worthless rock that contained nothing of value. And the offer was presented as a generous gesture of goodwill from the elder races to their grieving junior partner's ambassador. Chun accepted the offer with a polite smile and returned to Earth, where she briefed the leaders of human civilization on everything she had observed during the council session. Every subtle gesture and meaningful silence that revealed what the alien delegates truly thought of humanity and its dead. Something changed across human space in the weeks that followed, though it was difficult to say exactly what, because there were no riots in the streets or angry protests outside government buildings. And the news networks reported on the massacre with quiet dignity before moving on to other stories. But in factories that had produced consumer goods for generations, workers began quietly retooling their equipment for different purposes. And in universities where scientists had spent their careers on theoretical research, priorities shifted toward more practical applications. Young people who had never considered military service began appearing at recruitment offices, not in angry mobs, but in steady streams, day after day, week after week, until the offices had to expand their hours just to process all the applications. And in the halls of power, where politicians had spent 2 centuries counseling patience and cooperation, a new consensus began to emerge. Unspoken, but understood by everyone who mattered. The time for patience was ending, and the time for preparation had begun. Admiral Cole received orders to begin a comprehensive review of Earth's defensive capabilities. And he understood immediately that the word defensive was being used loosely, because the review would also include an assessment of offensive options that had been considered too provocative to pursue in peacetime. The Vela speaker noted, with some confusion that human trade delegations had become unusually polite in their dealings with other species. Always smiling, always agreeable, never pushing back on unfavorable terms the way they had in the past. A junior analyst in the Valeth Intelligence Service suggested that this sudden change in behavior might be concerning, that perhaps the humans were planning something behind their masks of compliance. But the speaker dismissed the observation with a wave of one crystalline limb. Humans were emotional creatures, the speaker explained, and emotional creatures eventually forgot their grievances and moved on with their lives. And besides, what could such a primitive species possibly do against the combined might of the Galactic Concord? The speaker would have been disturbed to know that, at that very moment, Ambassador L.R. Chun was sitting in a secure bunker beneath the mountains of Switzerland, presenting detailed intelligence reports to a council of war that included every major human leader, military and civilian alike. She showed them everything she had gathered in 30 years of diplomatic service: fleet positions, communication protocols, defensive weaknesses, political rivalries between Concord species, and 100 other details that would prove invaluable in the years to come. When she finished, Admiral Cole asked how long she thought they would need to prepare, and Chun considered the question carefully before answering. 10 years, she said, would be ideal, but 5 years would be sufficient if they worked quickly and quietly and never gave the aliens any reason to suspect what was coming. The council voted unanimously to begin preparations immediately, and as Chun left the bunker to return to her diplomatic duties among the stars, she allowed herself to remember the faces of the children she had seen in the recordings from the Meridian Hope. "We will remember you," she promised silently, "and one day they will remember us." 3 years had passed since the Meridian Massacre, and the galaxy had begun to notice that something was wrong with humanity. Though no one could quite identify what it was, human traders still visited alien ports to buy and sell goods, but they no longer lingered in cantinas or made small talk with other species. Arriving with their cargo, completing their transactions, and departing without a single unnecessary word, human scientists withdrew from collaborative research projects across the Concord, citing internal reorganization and shifting priorities. And the alien researchers who had worked alongside them for years found themselves suddenly cut off from colleagues who had once shared their findings openly. Human diplomats maintained their posts on every major world in the Concord, still attending meetings and signing agreements. But their eyes had changed somehow, becoming harder and more watchful, and even the most oblivious alien delegates began to feel uncomfortable in their presence. The Valeth Intelligence Service compiled report after report on these changes, noting patterns and anomalies that seemed to suggest something significant was happening in human space. But every attempt to investigate further was met with polite deflection and bureaucratic obstacles. Human space had become opaque, a dark region on galactic maps where information went in but rarely came out. And the elder species found this deeply unsettling, even if they could not explain exactly why Admiral Marcus Cole stood at the heart of this transformation. Now bearing the title of Supreme Commander of United Earth Forces, and he spent his days coordinating the greatest military buildup in human history, one that had been designed from the very beginning to remain invisible to alien eyes. The shipyards were the key to everything. Vast construction facilities hidden in asteroid fields and the upper atmospheres of gas giants, places where the Concord's surveillance networks could not easily reach. And these shipyards worked around the clock, producing vessels unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. The elder species had made the mistake of sharing their technology with humanity over 2 centuries of cultural exchange, believing that such primitive creatures could never truly understand the principles behind faster-than-light travel and energy weapons. And they had been partially correct in this assumption. Humans did not understand the technology the way the Vileth or the Korath understood it, as settled science that had been refined over millennia until it reached an optimal form, but instead, they saw possibilities and potential improvements that the elder species had stopped looking for long ago. Human engineers tore apart alien designs and rebuilt them according to principles that should not have worked, but somehow did, creating hybrid systems that combine the best elements of a dozen different technological traditions. And when the prototypes were tested in the depths of human space, the results exceeded even the most optimistic projections. Dr. Yuki Tanaka led the most secret project of all, a research initiative called Prometheus that operated from a facility buried beneath the frozen surface of a moon so remote that it did not even have a proper name. And her team of scientists had been given a simple mandate: develop weapons that the Concord considered impossible. The elder species had abandoned certain lines of research thousands of years ago, declaring them impractical or dangerous or simply not worth pursuing. But humans had no such institutional memory to hold them back. And Dr. Tanaka's team approached each abandoned concept with fresh eyes and fresh determination. They developed gravity lenses that could twist the fabric of space itself, crushing enemy vessels into unrecognizable shapes or tearing them apart at the molecular level. And they created electronic warfare systems that could infiltrate alien computer networks and turn ship intelligences against their own crews. The most terrifying weapon of all was something the researchers called the Silence, a device that could sever faster-than-light communication across entire star systems, cutting enemy fleets off from their command structures and leaving them blind and deaf in the middle of battle. Dr. Tanaka knew that her work would one day result in the deaths of millions of beings across the galaxy. And she made her peace with this knowledge by remembering the recordings from the Meridian Hope, the faces of children gasping for air as the cold crept in. And she worked harder than she had ever worked in her life across human space. Similar transformations were taking place in every sector of society, as the entire species quietly reorganized itself for war without ever speaking the word aloud. Schools began teaching history courses that emphasized human resilience and survival against overwhelming odds, from ancient battles against tyranny to the struggles of early space colonization. And young people grew up with a deep understanding of what their ancestors had endured and what they might one day be called upon to do. Physical fitness became a cultural obsession, with exercise facilities appearing in every neighborhood and competitive sports leagues drawing larger crowds than ever before. And the population grew stronger and healthier without anyone having to explain why this might be important. The entertainment industry shifted its focus towards stories of courage and sacrifice, tales of ordinary people who stood against impossible odds and emerged victorious through determination and unity. And these stories were consumed eagerly by audiences who felt something stirring in their hearts, even if they could not name it. Ambassador Chun continued her work among the stars, smiling at aliens who had dismissed the deaths of her people as a legal inconvenience, attending diplomatic functions where Korath warriors bragged about their military conquests while human servants poured drinks and pretended not to listen. She was no longer negotiating in any meaningful sense, because she knew that the time for negotiation had passed. But she was gathering intelligence of incalculable value, mapping weaknesses and recording secrets that would prove decisive when the war finally came. The Korath Dominion grew suspicious of human activities and attempted to infiltrate human space with spy networks, sending agents disguised as traitors and refugees to gather information about what was happening behind a veil of opacity. Most of these agents disappeared without a trace, their fates unknown, but one managed to penetrate a human shipyard on the edge of the Sol system. And what he saw there sent him racing back to Korath space with a warning that would shake the foundations of the Dominion. The spy's final transmission before human counterintelligence caught up with him contained only 2 words, sent in plain text with no encryption because there was no time for security protocols. "They're ready," the Korath High Command received the message and immediately demanded an audience with the veilless speaker. But the ancient insectoid was slow to respond, still convinced that humanity posed no serious threat to the established order of the galaxy. By the time the Concord finally agreed to discuss the situation, 3 more months had passed, and in the hidden shipyards of human space, the last of the new vessels rolled off the assembly lines, their crews trained and eager, their weapons systems tested and ready. Admiral Cole stood on the bridge of the flagship Remembrance, a vessel named for the 50,000 souls who had died aboard the Meridian Hope. And he looked out at a fleet that represented 2 centuries of patience and 3 years of focused preparation. The time for waiting was over. The time for remembering had begun. The Korath High Command made their decision on a cold morning in the depths of their homeworld's winter, gathered around a war table that had been used to plan conquests for over 10,000 years. And the decision was unanimous. Humanity must be destroyed before they could become a threat. The spy's warning had terrified them more than they would ever admit, because the Korath had built their entire civilization on the assumption that military strength was the only thing that mattered. And the thought of a species they had dismissed as weak and emotional somehow matching their power was intolerable. 400 warships gathered at the border of human space, the largest Korath fleet assembled in 3 centuries. Veterans of 100 conquests against species who had dared to challenge the natural order of the galaxy. And their commander was Admiral Vorath the Unbroken, a warrior who had never lost a battle in his long and bloody career. The target was Tau Ceti, one of humanity's oldest and most developed colony systems, home to 3 billion people who had built their lives under the light of a yellow sun not so different from Earth's. And the Korath planned to make an example of them that would echo through human space for generations. Admiral Vorath expected to find a token defense force, perhaps a few dozen human vessels crewed by frightened civilians, because his intelligence reports told him that humanity had no significant military presence anywhere in their territory. And the spy's warning was dismissed as the panicked imagination of a coward who had seen shadows and mistaken them for threats. The Korath fleet jumped into the Tau Ceti system at dawn by local time, their sensors sweeping the void for targets, their weapons already powering up for the slaughter to come. And for a long moment, there was nothing but empty space and the distant glow of the sun. Then the human fleet decloaked. 600 vessels appeared around the Korath formation, emerging from the darkness like predators who had been waiting patiently for their prey to walk into the trap. And Admiral Vorath stared at his tactical display in disbelief as the true scope of humanity's preparations became horrifyingly clear. These were not the clumsy civilian ships that the Korath had expected to face, but sleek and deadly weapons of war designed with a single purpose in mind. And their designs incorporated elements that Vorath had never seen before. Hybrid technologies that should not have been possible according to everything he knew about physics and engineering. The battle began before the Korath commander could issue orders, as the human fleet opened fire with weapons that twisted reality itself. Gravity lances that crushed dreadnoughts into balls of compressed metal, energy beams that cut through shields like they were not even there, and missiles that seemed to anticipate every evasive maneuver the Korath pilots attempted. Vorath ordered his communications officer to call for reinforcements, but the officer reported that all faster-than-light transmissions were being blocked by some kind of interference field. And the admiral realized with growing horror that his fleet had been cut off from the rest of the Dominion. Alone and blind in the middle of a battle they had expected to win easily, the human ships moved like nothing Vorath had ever seen, faster and more agile than any vessel in Korath service, piloted by crews who fought with a cold precision that was somehow more terrifying than the berserker fury the Korath usually faced in battle. There was no rage in the human attacks, no passion or hatred, just methodical efficiency as they dismantled the Korath formation one ship at a time, targeting engines first to prevent escape, then weapons to prevent resistance, and finally life support to ensure that every enemy vessel became a tomb. Admiral Varath ordered a desperate counterattack, sending his remaining ships in a mass charge toward the human flagship, hoping to at least destroy the enemy commander before his own fleet was annihilated. But the human vessels simply parted around the charging Korath like water flowing around a stone, continuing their systematic destruction without missing a beat. The Battle of Tau Ceti lasted 6 hours, and when it was over, 400 Korath warships had been reduced to drifting wreckage, their crews dead or dying, their commander's final transmission a scream of disbelief that was cut short when a gravity lance crushed his flagship into a sphere no larger than a human fist. The human fleet had lost 12 vessels. Word of the disaster spread through the Korath Dominion like wildfire, carried by traders and refugees who had witnessed the battle from the edges of the system. And the warrior species that had terrorized the galaxy for millennia found itself experiencing an unfamiliar emotion, fear. But humanity was not content with a single victory, because they had learned from their enemies that power must be demonstrated to be believed. And within days of the Battle of Tau Ceti, human fleets began appearing at Korath colony worlds throughout the Dominion. They did not come to bombard cities or slaughter civilians, because humanity had not forgotten what it meant to be merciful even after everything that had been done to them. And instead, they delivered a simple message to every world they visited: surrender your military assets, and your civilians will not be harmed, they said. And those who comply will be treated with dignity and respect. But those who resist will face the same fate as the fleet at Tau Ceti. Some Korath worlds surrendered immediately, their populations terrified by stories of the human weapons that could crush ships with invisible hands. But others chose to fight, believing that their warrior honor demanded resistance, even in the face of certain defeat. The humans honored their promise to those who surrendered, accepting weapons and military equipment while leaving civilian infrastructure intact. And they were scrupulously fair in their treatment of Korath prisoners, a mercy that confused the reptilian warriors more than any weapon could have. But for those who chose to fight, there was no mercy, only the cold efficiency of a species that had spent 2 centuries learning patience and 3 years learning how to wage war. And the Korath military installations that resisted were systematically destroyed until nothing remained but debris and silence. Admiral Cole watched the reports come in from across the Dominion, tracking the progress of his fleets as they dismantled the military power of a species that had murdered 50,000 of his people. And he felt no joy in the destruction, only a grim satisfaction that justice was finally being served. The Korath High Command sent desperate messages to the Valith, begging for intervention, for reinforcements, for anything that might stop the human advance. But the ancient insectoids were slow to respond, still processing the impossible reality that a species they had dismissed as primitive was systematically destroying one of the most powerful military forces in the galaxy. By the time the Vela speaker finally called an emergency session of the Concord Council, the Korath Dominion had lost 70% of its military capability, and human fleets were approaching the borders of Korath space itself. Ambassador Alara Chen attended the session, still wearing her diplomatic smile, and she listened politely as the Vela speaker demanded an explanation for humanity's unprovoked aggression against a fellow member of the Concord. She did not remind the speaker of the Meridian Hope, or the 50,000 colonists who had died watching stars through frozen viewports, or the dismissive words that had been spoken in this very chamber when she had begged for justice. She did not need to remind anyone of anything. The galaxy was finally learning what humanity had always known: that patience is not weakness, and silence is not surrender. And those who mistake kindness for cowardice do so at their own peril. 1 year had passed since the first shots of what the galaxy now called the Patience War, and the Korath Dominion had fallen, its once proud military reduced to scattered remnants hiding in the outer reaches of their territory, its leaders either dead or in human custody awaiting trial for crimes against humanity. The Galactic Concord trembled on the edge of collapse, as species that had tolerated each other for millennia, under Valeth guidance, now looked at their neighbors with suspicion and fear, wondering who else might be hiding capabilities behind a mask of compliance. The Valeth speakers summoned the full council for an emergency session. The first time all 47 member species had gathered in the same chamber in over 1,000 years. And the ancient insectoid looked out at the assembled delegates with something that might have been desperation in its crystalline eyes. Ambassador Alara Chun entered the chamber flanked by 2 human officers in dress uniforms, their presence a subtle reminder that humanity was no longer the junior partner it had once been. And she took her seat not among the minor delegates, but at the central table where the elder species had always gathered to make decisions that affected the entire galaxy. The Valeth speaker began with a lengthy speech about the importance of galactic unity and the dangers of allowing conflicts between member species to escalate, carefully avoiding any mention of the Meridian Massacre or the decades of discrimination that had preceded it. Chun listened patiently, her face revealing nothing of her thoughts. And when the speaker finally finished and asked if the human delegation had anything to add, she rose from her seat and walked to the speaking platform with the calm confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was going to say. She did not begin with accusations or demands for apologies, because humanity had learned long ago that words meant nothing without the power to enforce them. And instead, she simply presented what she called the new understanding. Humanity did not want to rule the galaxy, she explained, because ruling meant responsibility, and humans had enough responsibilities of their own without taking on the burden of governing species that had never shown them any kindness or respect. What humanity wanted was equality, true equality that was not written in treaties or protocols, but enforced by the simple reality that humanity could no longer be ignored or contained or controlled. And this equality would extend not just to humans, but to every species that had been relegated to developmental zones and treated as lesser beings by the elder races. The Valeth speaker interrupted to point out that the Concord had always treated all member species equally under the law. And Chun smiled her diplomatic smile and replied that the law meant nothing when those who enforced it were the same ones who benefited from its violations. She presented evidence of centuries of exploitation, discrimination, and outright theft that the elder species had perpetrated against younger civilizations. Crimes that had been hidden behind bureaucratic language and legal technicalities, but were crimes nonetheless. And she asked the assembled delegates a simple question: how many other species were sitting in their developmental zones at this very moment, nursing grievances and counting the days until they too would be strong enough to demand justice? And would it not be wiser to address these grievances now, peacefully, rather than waiting for another war to break out? The chamber fell silent as the delegates considered her words, and Chun could see the fear in their alien eyes, the sudden realization that humanity might not be the only species they had underestimated. Back on Earth, Admiral Marcus Cole watched the proceedings from Fleet Command, surrounded by officers who had spent the past year transforming human military doctrine from a theoretical exercise into a proven reality. And he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction before returning to work The war had taught humanity something important about their place in the galaxy. They were not alone in their suffering, and the same system that had oppressed them had oppressed countless other species as well. Coded messages had begun arriving at human embassies from a dozen different civilizations. Young species that had watched the Patience War with growing hope, asking the same question that burned in all their hearts. How did you do it? And can you teach us? Cole knew that the Valith and the other elder species would eventually recover from the shock of humanity's transformation and begin looking for ways to contain this new threat. Because that was what powerful beings always did when faced with challenges to their authority. And humanity would need allies when that day came, the Valith speaker, in a private moment after the council session, consulted ancient records that had not been accessed in 50,000 years, searching for precedents that might help guide the Concord through this crisis. The last species to challenge Concord hegemony had been called the Architects, brilliant engineers who had built structures that still dotted the galaxy, and they had been systematically annihilated by a coalition of elder species who feared what they might become if allowed to reach their full potential. The Valith had led that coalition, and they had justified the genocide by claiming that the Architects posed an existential threat to galactic stability. And for 50,000 years, they had believed that they had done the right thing. Now, looking at the human ambassador who sat calmly in the council chamber, negotiating terms for a new galactic order as if she had been doing it her entire life, the speaker wondered if perhaps the Valith had made a terrible mistake all those millennia ago. Perhaps the galaxy needed species like the Architects, and like humanity, species that refused to accept their assigned place in the hierarchy and demanded something better, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had been told they were not worthy of respect. The new understanding was signed 3 months later, a document that rewrote the fundamental laws of the Galactic Concord and established principles of equality that had never existed before. And while the elder species grumbled about human arrogance and the decline of civilization, they signed nonetheless, because they had no other choice in a research facility beneath the frozen surface of a nameless moon. Daiuki Tanaka briefed a new generation of scientists on the challenges that lay ahead, explaining that Project Prometheus had only been the beginning and that humanity's journey was far from over. The elder species would not accept their diminished status forever, she warned, and humanity would need to continue innovating, continue pushing the boundaries of what was possible, continue preparing for threats that had not yet emerged. But she also spoke of hope, of the possibility that the galaxy might one day become a place where all species were truly equal, where the strong did not automatically prey upon the weak, and where the patient endurance of oppressed peoples might finally be rewarded with justice. On a memorial station orbiting the spot where the Meridian Hope had died, a wall of polished stone bore the names of 50,000 people who had been murdered for the crime of existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. And below those names, carved in letters that would endure for as long as the station itself, was a simple inscription: "We remembered, we prepared, we answered." Ambassador Alara Chen visited the memorial on the anniversary of the massacre, standing before the wall of names with her head bowed and her hands clasped in front of her. And she thought about the journey that had brought humanity from that moment of tragedy to this moment of triumph. They had not become monsters in their pursuit of justice, she reflected, though they had certainly become dangerous. And the galaxy would never again make the mistake of dismissing human determination as weakness or human patience as submission. The stars burned cold and distant beyond the memorial station's viewports, the same stars that the colonists of the Meridian Hope had watched as they died. And Chun made a silent promise to those 50,000 souls that their sacrifice would never be forgotten. The galaxy had tested humanity's patience, and war had become inevitable. But from that war had emerged something new, A humanity that knew its own strength. A Concord that had been forced to confront its own failings. And a future that held possibilities that had seemed impossible just a few years before Chun turned away from the memorial wall and walked back toward her shuttle, ready to return to the endless work of building that future. And she smiled her diplomatic smile, the same smile she had worn for 30 years of service, among aliens who had never understood what it concealed. But the smile meant something different now. It was no longer a mask hiding grief and rage and determination, but an expression of genuine hope for what humanity and the galaxy might one day become together. The patience war was over. The real work was just beginning.